Hello and welcome back to Parley. These are my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. This one is from Liquid, hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about sandboxes, or like testing rooms. In games with meaningful build systems, why don't more build-centric games have sandbox modes? Liquid explains, the broadest definition of, like, the simulacrum in Warframe is a testing ground sandbox, where you can test out mechanics and configurations in almost complete freedom. This is a feature that other big games, some of which are also coincidentally live service titles themselves, for example, MiHoYo's suite of games like Genshin Impact, Fate Grand Order, and Fire Emblem Heroes, just to name a few, you named all gacha games, which we'll come back to, would arguably benefit from this feature, but such a feature is absent in a lot of those games. What's stopping games with a high number of playable units, game mechanics, or anyway, build options from making a sandbox mode where you can just lab out different combinations like you can in the Simulacrum in Warframe, or other games have testing modes? It wouldn't necessarily need to be as deep as the Simulacrum or some other systems. Monster Hunter, some of them have interesting, pretty involved training grounds. But at least the option to lab without having to, for instance, repeat endgame content, where that build optimization would actually matter, would be a welcome way to actually test things. Cool, and then it just so happens that one of your fellow Parley patrons has weighed in, so there is a comment weighing in from Just Rusty as well that I'll read at the end. I think it's an interesting ballasting point, though I have the same point to make as well. Cool. Yes, this is a great question. On the surface level, I feel like it's a pretty straightforward question. If game about interesting combinations of gameplay elements, why no ability to focus on that alone without like the pressure of the rest of the content? But I actually think that the real problems with including this in a game are pretty complicated. So what I'm going to do in this parlay, I think what is going to be a good way to do this is to talk about the sort of surface level pros and cons, and then the what's the deal though, like the level below. Something smells off. You'll see when we put those pros and cons together and what the hell is going on here. And then I surprisingly in this one, I often don't feel this way in parlay. I pretty confidently have some actual solutions, so I will suggest those. I don't know, for whatever that's worth. I feel like people usually shy away from doing what is often described as armchair development, but if you explain your reasoning, there's no need to fear. The only thing that matters is if you have a good argument. It doesn't matter if you, whether you consider me a game developer or not is not really relevant, and it's not disrespectful to real game developers to just explain what you think would be better and why. I don't really get why people shy away from that so much unless they just don't have reasons for thinking that would be a good idea. Anyway, so I'm not going to do that. I just candidly often do not know how to solve the problem, but I feel like here I have I think some pretty decent suggestions, so I'm going to try to say them. Cool. So normal pros and cons of adding these sandbox places. What's the deal? And then solution? Zandy armchair game dev solution? I hate armchairs. Anyway, normal pros and cons. I think the pros are probably pretty obvious to a lot of people, and certainly they seem obvious to you, Liquid. If the game is about making these combinations of effects, well, why wouldn't you have a way to test them on their own? Some parts of these games focus only on their, let's say, live action combat, and don't really focus on the game's build system. So why not also have parts of the game that focus just on the game's build system? That can make it a lot easier to combine those things later. Or if the game includes this element, why is it so bad to have players playing around with it? On the surface level, I think it's important to be aware, and we're probably going to be doing pro-con, that one of the big cons to a lot of people is that some people consider literally anything that is in a menu to not be part of the game. Actually, literally anything that is not what they see as the single, and there can only be one according to them, primary gameplay loop, the rule of the Sith, a master and an apprentice, and the build system is the apprentice, I guess. And so to them, it might be that, well, the build system literally just isn't part of the game. I mean, going even further, this is above the surface level to the point of being dehydrated because it's such a simplistic thought. But a lot of people do think this. the build system isn't part of the game. It's just a dumb puzzle to solve. You look up a build, you look up what's actually good, you part the secrets and red herrings of the build system and learn what is actually good, and then you just use that. Now, of course, if the game has any reason to have build options, that's not what a real build system is. In these games, whether the players are aware of it or not, there are many good ways to play. And just because a lot of players don't like think that's true or haven't experienced that to be true, it makes them never mind. Yeah, and I don't think that a majority of players do actually think that. I think a lot of people don't think at all about games they play from a game design perspective. And so if the game presents a lot of options, they probably basically assume that a good number of options are viable. And they only think that they aren't if they get into the deeper community of the game and look at a bunch of builds and try only the most popular or clicked on builds of those, which then work for them and they assume the rest is silly. They're almost always incorrect. I can't tell you how many times I've played like 1,000 hours of a game, or like hundreds of hours of a game, gone to the subreddit or whatever of a game, seen people saying that only X type of build is viable, but know from extensive personal experience that that just completely isn't true at all, and they just don't know. They just haven't tried it, and they want a simplistic understanding. That's okay, but it's not real. Like they're just wrong. Sorry. That in most games that's just not true. And if you try many different options in these games using good theory to make the build as good as it's going to be, you will find that in the majority of games that have build systems, there absolutely is not one single best build. If the game or the game is just bad, basically. So I don't think it's a good argument to say the build system isn't part of the game, and we're mostly going to just dismiss that now. But I wanted to acknowledge it because it's what a lot of people think. So normal pros and cons. I mean, the pro here is it is part of the game. And so, why would you not have a place to test it? Going a little bit further, there are lots of builds where I kind of see where we're going with this, obviously, is that not everything needs to be tested. And there are definitely types of builds where I don't really see why you would urgently need to not just try it live, basically. Good stuffy builds that are doing a well-rounded and pretty low synergy approach, where each individual piece is kind of just what it is. You can often kind of imagine or eyeball, if you've played the game, how good that will be. And then if you go into a mission, you're probably not going to completely fail. You'll go through it a little bit, but then, maybe this or that part of your build isn't that well tuned, or that piece doesn't really do much for you as much as you thought or hoped it would, and then you die. But you got through like half of the mission or whatever, and so you can go back into your build interface and pretty easily think, oh, well, I'll just bring this. I didn't have enough AoE, and then you have that, and then it's fine, right? Absolutely. There are some builds, I guess this is in the con category, where it doesn't really make sense to need to do this. However, pro category, there are also lots of kinds of builds, and I think a majority of interesting builds where you kind of do need to test this out. For a simple example, let's talk about combo builds. If you've played any amount of like a trading card game, right now I'm playing Magic the Gathering and Pokemon TCG Pocket, a good amount of the interesting decks are combo-like. If you don't get them just about exactly calibrated, they do literally actually nothing. They actually literally do not do anything. Or they just like draw a bunch of cards that don't do anything and then lose. Whereas if you have them, 90% tuned, suddenly they basically do the thing, and then you can optimize it from there. These are types of builds, therefore, that test like live test very poorly. They usually just blatantly don't do anything at all, and you learn very little, I would argue, by just failing these builds live. They're builds where it makes a lot more sense to do something to test them out. However, a lot of combo builds also have a lot of trouble firing against overly weak challenges. So this would be stuff like you run just the right amount of interference or removal to slow down your opponent, or you have a combo that works with a mechanic that the enemy does, like they attack you enough or get you to low enough health. And so for those builds, you literally can't use easier content live to test the build. It will make the build not work. And I actually reckon this is more common than you would think. Just to use Warframe as an example, since you brought it up. There's a lot of builds and good weapons in Warframe that require a target-rich enough environment that it literally just doesn't happen outside of high-level play. And so you can't test the build except against the close to hardest content level available, but you probably won't be able to complete that content without other players in the mix. That's another thing. A testing room often lets you avoid having other players in the mix, yet experience, something like the content, as difficult as it can be. So, major pro. There are some parts of a lot of build systems, and I reckon for many people, some of the more interesting parts of those build systems that you kinda can't use without the ability to test them somehow. And we're gonna get back to this topic, but doing that in like lower level gameplay, lacking a testing room, often doesn't work. Like you just can't, and isn't really an indication of how good the build is either. We will again get back to that as well. Okay, now we come to the big con. And as Just Rusty is going to respond later, if you're wondering, like, well, there literally are no negatives, like, why don't you just let people do a testing room? Well, there is one big negative that I think is pretty unavoidable and pretty well documented. And it is I'm going to call it the optics of the situation. If you make a testing room like this, and it is beneficial to do so, which I feel I've mostly demonstrated, well, a lot of the content about builds in the game is going to be in that testing room, not in a mission. And this means that your core audience, the invested and slightly more hardcore players, will be using that as the way that they, promote videos. Those videos will get popular. Can you see where this is going? And then a good amount of the marketing and community presence for your game is those videos. But those videos are shown mostly to people who are not that core audience. It becomes that the ads for your game are something that is only relevant or interesting to somebody already invested in your game. And this is bad. Like, that's not good, sure. It's also unrealistic, as we're going to get into more later. A lot of the time, you can, but players don't, take a step to say, in this test, we demonstrated this, but remember, in a real mission, like, it would be more like this, and then show some gameplay in a real mission. If you've watched a lot of build videos, you'll know that people often do not do this. They just skip that step. And I would say, and you'll see, not to brag, other people do this, but in my videos, you will see that I will pretty much always, if I show a testing room, I will always also show gameplay, at least now. Maybe a long time ago, like 10 years ago, I didn't do that, but I certainly do it now, and I tried to in the past. It's more fun. I mean, that's why I did it, but now I'm doing it because it's more accurate. It's not really that hard to imagine a lot of the time, but people don't. I don't know, for whatever reason, whether they know it or not. Yes, I've seen a lot of videos that basically just don't acknowledge how unrealistic the simulacrum is. This significantly shifts conversation about the game. That's the con here. It makes the optics of the game a little weird from a marketing perspective. It makes the community have kind of the wrong impression of a level of gameplay they might not yet be at, being demonstrated like this in a kind of unrealistic way. And you might think this is a little extreme, but I would even go so far as to say a lot of the players doing that testing themselves don't know just how bad their builds work in actual gameplay. They just don't do that much. Now, my fellow creators, I'm not trying to take a gigantic steaming dump all over your work schedule. I understand, you're doing this because you feel rushed. You're often working a normal job and then coming home at night to make like the build video so that your YouTube channel, the passion project you hope will become a full career at some point, will get off the ground. And so you want it to be as quick as possible. And I think that's all good. That's fine. Without getting into this too much, because it's kind of a different topic, it would take like maybe a minute or two to just say, here might be the differences in a normal mission. And I don't really accept that it would be that hard to just show literally any other time other than the testing room that you've used this thing, just any gameplay footage from anywhere else in the game that you've used this tactic that you're showing in the testing room. Like that wouldn't be that hard, folks. But anyway, I do understand, having been in that position myself, but I just have different motivations than those people, I guess. So that's the situation as I would see it. We're at a bit of an impasse to start. What smells off to me is this. Watch. It seems to make total sense. Yeah, there's parts of a lot of build systems that you more or less can't use unless you have a way to test them out. And a lot of the time, those are really interesting or fun parts of those build systems. But having a sterile testing room that is outside gameplay where you test those things significantly warps the optics of the game. What do? You basically need a way to test meaningfully that is in a mission. Am I telegraphing clearly enough what I think the solution would be here? Anyway, and I think that there's a level below here. The thing that smells off is, why does it seem to people like it's bad for the optics of the game to be like a bunch of its build system? Like, maybe the players do experience this issue if the game has a bunch of build videos or whatever that are in this testing room. But there are also lots of games where there is a testing room, but people don't do that. Like, that just isn't the culture. I also think that a lot of developers and publishers especially don't want there to be a testing room, but it's not for that exact reason. It's for a marketing related reason, which is the game seems too technical. The game seems too about its build system. They think, and this is a very, I learned this from the gaming industry. People inside the industry told me this. This is not my idea. I wouldn't have believed it. Say that very few people use the build system in the game. That is, of the players who play the game, the build system is really a toy for the more invested player, rather than like a core part of the game, I guess, is what they're arguing. Sort of an end game activity, rather than something that is an integrated part of the game. Oh, that's an interesting argument. Why does the game have build systems for its entire runtime then? Like, that's kind of just bad. You could argue that game design is just bad. And it is, I think, in a lot of games. The divide between the optics and like the situation on the ground is weird, partly because most games have deeply questionable reasons for having their build system there, and don't really understand that having the player faff around and make all these decisions for huge amounts of time as they play through the game, only to get to the end game, and then it actually all matters, is just very bad game design, and it's just very normal currently. But that's very bad. That's like just about the worst way you can do it. If you're going to make a build system, if you're going to make a game anyway, you're asking players to make some kind of decision. In an action game, you're asking the players whether they want to go in, focus on dodging, go back and heal, whatever it is. In a build system, you're asking them what they want in this slot. The way to make a good game is to make those decisions meaningful. And so if most games start with 20 hours of a ton of build system decisions, but they're not meaningful because you haven't gotten to like the end game part yet, like, yes, I understand that demographically, not very many people actually make real builds in your build system, but that's just because your game has a deeply flawed implementation of build systems. And again, the problem here is that on its own would be fine. I think people would just notice that, but it's extremely common in the current gaming industry. I think it's getting less common, but just a lot of games are like that. There's a huge amount of, especially AAA titles, that just give you a ton of loot, that gives you like 2% crit chance, and that doesn't ever add up. Don't get any ideas. There are games where that could be meaningful, but this game doesn't add it up to something meaningful at all. It's going to have like 3% damage against robots. You don't even know which enemies those are, and this is not put here to be meaningful. It's put here to be a bit of faff that makes the game seem confusing, I guess. And a lot of people interpret confusing things as deep, but they're not necessarily. And so you have a lot of games that do this, which therefore makes it seem not as weird to have, but that's just bad. I'm the person who's focused on the subject telling you, I don't know, I think those are just bad. That's just not good. So yes, there is a level below where the way the game acts about its build system is kind of weird and smelly. But I think that the solution is just that it can just be bad to design a game that way. That's okay. It doesn't need to be that just because the topic of the subject is sandboxes or testing rooms, that is the only thing that can be blamed here. Like, it is fair to say, unfortunately, since you've completed your whole game, this entire part is basically pointless and makes the game much worse. But unfortunately, that's how it is. If you've ever edited prose before, and why not? It's a lot of fun. Write a story. Just right now, go write a short story, 5 pages or whatever, and just chop out a whole page. Force yourself to cut 1 out of 5 pages. Not necessarily all in one go or all in the same place, reduce the length of the work by 20%. I think this is an interesting rule of thumb. In most stories, the error in the story will often beneficially comprise about 20% of it. You can absolutely delete that stuff, and the story will work, but it's always interesting to see what happens. And I can only imagine that people who are concerned about this have not done it. Like, it's okay. It's not your precious child. Right, the real problem is that it's an investor property, right? You're not writing a story all by yourself. And so the reason that these games have these systems is not that the developer wants to waste hours of your time faffing around. It's because they didn't think about this subject at all in the first place, put that in, and then only after realize that it's vapid and pointless. But they already spent hundreds of thousands of dollars of development budget on it. So they're not going to take that out, even though they still should, because it's still completely pointless. The money is wasted if it's put in even more, because it wastes more time from our sadly limited lives. Anyway, you can't remove the money from being wasted. It's already been wasted. Deleting that part of the game would be less of a waste. Anyway, whatever. We're not soapbox. Get that out of there. You asked this topic. You knew it was going to happen. Of course, I'm going to say the industry is terribly broken with the way it thinks about build systems. Okay, but the point is, yeah, there's a lot of benefits to these testing rooms, but also a lot of optics problems. And just like I was saying, if it's going to be a meaningful decision, put it in the game if it's a meaningful decision. Well, it's also not good for the player to make unnecessary decisions. If you basically need to use the testing room. Now, again, some people are thinking, well, I play a game with a testing room and I don't use it. You don't need to use it. But I'm just saying, if in the design document you're adding these build system ideas and it's complicated enough to figure out that conceivably someone would need time to get to grips with the build, that's part of the game. So in a way, a level even below her, what smells off here is, why is the testing room optional at all? You basically need to use it to use the build system meaningfully. So why isn't that more integrated into the game? Yes, that's what I'm saying. My problem with testing rooms is actually that they're not required, not that they're not present. Is that in games where they're present, you can choose not to use them, but if they make sense to be in the game, you would basically need to use them to have the good experience. And the game knows that, but either doesn't include them or doesn't force you to use them. Where I'm going with this is, it should be integrated as a part of normal gameplay. Yes, I'm suggesting that you make a game mode that is specifically for players to bring builds that they aren't sure are that good yet, to test them out. Like in missions that are, by the way, rewarding, that you get something for. To fully integrate this into games, these sandbox modes or testing rooms are, in my opinion, an incomplete solution. And rather than going back up, get rid of the sandbox, I'm saying you need to more fully integrate the sandbox for it to be a good experience. To the point that it probably won't seem like a sandbox. You might have played games before where you felt like, oh, well, this or that challenge mode or piece of content, lacking a true sandbox or testing room is the best we have to like try out, this new strategy. And perhaps in some cases, those were put there on purpose. Now, I think that the complete version of this would be to telegraph it to players. Like, I will in great detail lay out what I mean by, like, what would you do to do this? You need to find a way to incentivize as part of the game design, to fully integrate it into the game, that you would specifically play this piece of content in a way where it's beneficial to use a wide variety of maybe incomplete builds. Like, how do you do that? Well, you can. We'll get into it a little. That's what I'm suggesting. I am at this juncture curious to get into the nuances of what I'm saying and what Just Rusty says. So I think this is a good time to read that. And then we'll come back to the topic of how do you make an integrated sandbox, basically. Well, I'm not sure if this... So this is Just Rusty, not Liquid, your fellow patron. This doesn't happen often, but I do allow it. People can respond to these, and I think this was pretty on topic, so I thought we should discuss it. Just Rusty weighs in. As a certified sandbox hater, nice, good timing, let me give my 2 cents. Something we saw when Warframe put out the Simulacrum was that every video about a new weapon demonstrated it by testing it in the Simulacrum and used that as a benchmark, not its in-game application. I think as long as the game is clear with the information it gives you and the verbiage of how your build pieces interact, which is very rare but increasingly common, and there's no penalty from playing a run with a build piece, like in an extraction shooter or similar, there's rarely an actual need for a sandbox mode, and they really shift the conversation from the real applications of build pieces to their performance in a lab setting. That part is similar to the point I was making before about the optics issue. I think people often present labbing as having no downside and being pure upside with little dev time, but I think there's a very high cultural cost. Again, I was putting this as this optics issue of introducing one to a game. Yeah. For any individual person using it, there's only upside. I don't agree with that, but I think it can be a cognitive hazard that negatively impacts discussion about builds in that game long term. Yeah. So again, just Rusty, I agree. You're very eloquently putting the point I made in much more time. So well done. That basically the testing room affects the discussions around the game a lot. Sure. I think there's a few additional things in here, though. So you can see Just Rusty kind of flirting with the idea that I'm bringing up as well. As long as the game is clear with the information it gives you and there's no penalty for playing a run with a build piece, why do you need a sandbox mode? Well, that suggests, oh, we'll just play the normal game. I'm suggesting make a mode in the normal game that is specifically for a testing round like that. But it's kind of the same thing. Like, why does it need to not be live, rewarding gameplay, but also be a sandbox, basically? Why can't you just test it live? And probably for a little while, some members of the audience who are used to playing like Elden Ring or something have been feeling a little uncomfortable about this subject, because why can't people just like get used to failing? And that's fine. The only reason you need a sandbox, some people would say, is because you're not desensitized to losing, because you don't attempt things earnestly often enough. And I think that's literally true. That is, in literal terms, if you were to, try, a mission in these games and fail, a lot of people would feel upset in their relaxing time. But the only reason that bothers them is because they haven't pushed through it to the golden plains of Elysium on the other side, or the lands between, if you like, Elden Ring group, the Tree of Emptiness, to understand that it's okay to just fail at it, and that can be relaxing. Now, I'm here to tell you, yeah, it can. Sure, I'm in the lands between. I think anyway. I absolutely was previously a player who did not like repeatedly losing and found that stressful and not relaxing, and then eventually simply removed that experience. And now I do not experience that anymore. And so, I mean, you should know as an individual that you can do that if you want to. But I also don't think that this addresses the whole situation. As we discussed before, there are lots of types of builds that won't even work unless they're mostly complete. So already there's just no way for those builds to work live in endgame content unless you were to get them right away, and that's not feasible. It still makes sense to have some step below of some sort. You just might not agree that it should be a sandbox, and I agree with that as well. You can make it into a game mode of its own. We'll get into it. But I also wanted to note that for a lot of people, the mechanical practice is an issue. So let's go back to Elden Ring as an example. You play some Elden Ring and you're fighting this boss and you die. And there's a certain attack, or maybe you're doing a maneuver that you are physically, kinesthetically with the controller having trouble executing. I think something people often overlook is that humans are often a lot better at learning and practicing something if they don't need to do it only live. That is, if they're allowed to do it with like lower stakes. Now, this often doesn't require a testing room. I can't tell you how many times in Elden Ring I pulled out like a weapon I had or something, or used an Ash of War or something like that I just wanted to see what it would do and like practice moving with it, or practice doing it in a certain way, or see if there is an animation cancel available for this attack. I don't know, something like that, right? And you can just do that on like a dirt road somewhere and then trot over to the boss and try it there. But I do want to stress that I think a lot of people are overlooking that element. There is a real cognitive benefit to being able to test something without the pressure of failure. Failure and avoiding failure is mostly, I would agree, but not only, I would disagree, a matter of people like wussing out of the failure, right? Yes, a lot of people aren't used to and don't like to fail. That's stressful to them. It is a thing that you can grow out of if you want to, but sure, that is a thing that bothers a lot of people. But that's not the only effect of going to a testing room. It's not like the only thing you're doing is protecting yourself from failure. There is a learning benefit as well. So I don't really accept this as an argument. Now, in Elden Ring and games like it, there are enough fodder enemies around that I actually think that's a real strength of these games, and enough mini bosses or tanky enemies that I really don't think it's a huge issue. You get a lot of practice with your kit, unless you change your build like really often. I don't know who would do that. That it's not a huge issue. And in many ways, the success of those games is that they incorporate those enemies, which are easier and would be fodder for a powerful build, in a way that makes them threatening somehow. For example, a trick Elden Ring often uses is similar to D&D, where a lot of encounters are designed to exhaust your resources, your flasks, or, your mana or whatever, not to outright kill you. And you can very easily clear those encounters if you use everything at your disposal. But if you do that, then you'll run out of those resources later on. And so they challenge you to not use some parts of your kit, which is an interesting way to incorporate weaker enemies, and also provides environments where, yeah, there is a reasonably tanky enemy here that you will beat, like you're not likely to lose to. And it might be a place where they have enough health that you can test out this new tactic. This is a pretty good example of what I mean by integrating the sandbox or the testing room into the game. These games that have an open world sandbox, well, you could just like go over there and fight those enemies. And they're balanced in a way where they're not just weaker. There's a different kind of stakes to the encounter, if that makes sense. And this can often work, I think, as a way to test things. But I just wanted to focus in that I don't think it's enough to just say, oh, people aren't used to losing, basically. Again, just Rusty, not that you're saying that. But I think the Elden Ring or whatever crowd has been grumbling about that for a lot of this video. And yeah, I understand, but I also don't think that's the whole picture. So yeah, and of course we need to get into a few other minor details. As you were saying, just Rusty, for a lot of games, if you're going to remove the sandbox, you also need to remove some nuts and bolts things that you really shouldn't ever need to do in games, but which a lot of games do ask you to do, which is, for example, to figure out, the information it gives you and the verbiage of how all your build pieces interact. That is, the game has to actually tell you what things in the game do. If something says throw a fireball that does fire damage and it doesn't tell you how much or how big the fireball is or whatever, it just tells you the cost or whatever, people have a tendency to say, oh, that's fine. But I mean, if you're making an intentional build, you would want to know those things. It is not being pedantic or like a nerd to want to know that stuff. It's part of the game to build around those things in many cases. So in a lot of games that don't tell you that information, a sandbox is useful or even necessary for a pretty unrelated reason to all this discussion, which is just the game is so unclear that you're not very likely to be able to figure out what things do unless you have the ability to test them. Thankfully, the 21st century has mostly executed this stupid problem from our industry by the internet. The information age has meant you can usually just look up exactly what things do if the game doesn't tell you. And for whatever reason, about simultaneous with that, I've started to notice a real uptick in how often games include all this stuff in the game. Playing something like Gambonanza or when I was playing Pokemon TCG Pocket, or a ton of games I've played recently, really, let's just look at the Steam list, have specifically included a thing where you can just pull up like the entire rules of the game right there, and whenever you scroll over an enemy that has an effect on them, it just says what the effect does, because it's pretty dumb for it not to. Like, why would that's a waste of the player's time. Back in the day, in the 90s or whatever, I was alive for some time where people were quite keen on figuring this out themselves, but that age has passed, and now you could do that if you wanted to, that's fine, but I don't think it makes very much sense for the player to not get that information in-game when it is impossible for it not to be available online, or nearly impossible. The game could be very obscure. I would suggest, if you're a developer that wants to create this experience, that you do not think, oh, well, we'll just hope the player doesn't look it up on the internet. No, bad. Spray. Make an option in the options menu that turns off the tooltips, but default to having them be on. The player can then turn them off if they want to. Great. Anyway, I'm very pleased to see that most games have decided you should just tell the player all that stuff. Yeah, I mean, I think 9 times out of 10, if you think there's a good reason to not tell the player how the game mechanics work, there isn't. I'm open to there maybe sometimes being a reason for that. I have played a few games. We could talk about that sometime, but that's not this parlay. There you go. Well, it is kind of this parlay. So, yeah. Obviously, a benefit of the testing room is that, like, you can gain information about the game, but in many cases, that ought not to be necessary. And then you said no penalty for playing a run with a build piece. Yeah, there are extraction shooters. No, it's not called The Culling, but that is also a game that's kind of similar. But in, I'm trying to say, Hunt Showdown, this is a game where it's an extraction shooter and your character permanently dies if you die. Like that, they're deleted and you have to recruit somebody else, and they can level up and like you can buy items for them and stuff that would be permanently lost if they died. It is therefore more appropriate in those games to let the player test things out, because if they try and fail one time, that thing is permanently gone. I also personally think this is a place where I'm going to suggest one very specific time that a sandbox, a real sandbox, not integrated into gameplay, would be very helpful, that I don't think ever seen, and it is very specifically in the middle of a roguelike run. To explain what I mean, in a lot of games, you pick a roguelike upgrade, and even if the game does an admirable job of showing you, oh, this is going to give you an attack with this AoE, and you get a little movie on the side of it when you scroll over it that shows you what the attack will look like, and it tells you what all the effects do, and the game does great with all that stuff, sure. You pick it, but then you go right into the next room. And again, like in my Hunt Showdown example, if you die, you die, it's gone, you know? Additionally, in these games, you actually can't usually choose to get these upgrades deliberately without playing a run. That is, you don't even have a build when you're not in the middle of a run. So even if you can kind of derp around in a testing environment like Hades or Hades 2, you pick your weapons and there's Skelemaeus who you can use as a target dummy. Like, yeah, that stuff is all there, but you can't have boons while you're there. So in those environments, in those games, I think it's very valuable if you can create a situation where the player can try out their attacks briefly at some moment in the middle of a run. Pause briefly and check to make sure that they know what the thing actually does, or that the interaction works the way it does, so they don't have to just run into a wall and have the build die. I've had a lot of creative ideas while playing these games that I did not do because I knew I didn't know exactly how the interaction would work, and if it works this way, the run is just instantly over. I would be slam dunking my free time into the trash, so I'm not going to do it. But it would be extremely easy to let the player test that out. Again, implementing a sandbox is probably very easy for most developers. It depends on the game. There could be games where it isn't. But for this kind of thing, the pause menu ability to teleport yourself into a testing room for 5 seconds and just try it out, I feel like that would not be that hard to add. And in many cases, I don't know, I feel like you really do want that in these cases. And you're in the middle of gameplay, so it's not like you're going to make some other game mode. You know what I mean? Like, this is the place for a real sandbox, in my opinion. And it is one of the places I have, I think, never seen a real sandbox. So I'm sure there are games that have one. Probably not in the middle of a run, though, which is where I reckon they would be the most useful. But trying combinations of boons or whatever outside of a run would help as well. And I think, again, is a place where a real sandbox where you literally can just God mode and pick whatever you want would help in those cases. So there you go. I think part of the reason we don't see that as often is because it feels like you get the crazy run without the work. So maybe developers don't want to do that, but good news, I think it's the most valuable in the middle of a run anyway, which would not have that problem. Anyway, aside about roguelikes aside, let's talk about the integrating the sandbox into the gameplay thing from before. So what I mean specifically is not just offering a variety of gameplay. This often kind of works. You know, I'm sure you've played games before where there's a variety of different ways to play. And so, yes, because the game doesn't offer a sandbox or testing room, you play this or that other game mode to attempt to do your best to test the thing out, while, yes, you are playing the real gameplay, but not like the full challenging level of gameplay or whatever. As we talked about before, this doesn't always work as a solution. There are plenty of builds where the build is about responding to the difficult gameplay that's there, so you really do need to test it against something that is appropriately challenging there. And the build might be hard enough to tune that you won't actually get any results until you've gotten it exactly right. So the ability to somewhat contrive a test is valuable. Furthermore, we made the point about movement. Sometimes simply physically operating the game requires specific enough behavior that while you could repeatedly smash your head into a wall and you would eventually learn to do it, humans do often learn better if they just don't have to do that and they can test it in a safer, less overstimulating environment. Those neurons fire together more coherently or whatever is happening, but I think it's pretty well documented and you can demonstrate for yourself. It can be a lot easier to learn things if there's not a bunch of stuff going on. So all those reasons mean it can be very helpful for there to be something like a sandbox or testing room. But we also discussed it does seem kind of unnecessary for it to be like not real gameplay. There are lots of problems with that, and also just like why it's not clear that it needs to not be rewarding gameplay, just as an example. And people who think, Zandy's taking my sandbox, I thought you were the one person I could count on to argue for a sandbox. I'm basically arguing that they make a better sandbox that gives you in-game rewards. Like, that this is a good thing. Like, we're all benefiting here. I'm suggesting only a have your cake and eat it too situation. Only a situation where we get all the benefits of a sandbox that we actually need. Again, you don't need to use the sandbox to like learn the information in the game. That should just be available in most cases. But, the learning and the etc. So what are the components that this game mode needs to have? I would say I can think of three. So the first one is that you have some control over the challenge. This is to mimic the effect of the sandbox. A lot of the time, just fighting any higher level enemies will not exactly do, and you do want some choice over what those enemies are. So number one, that you have some control over what the challenge is. The level or the type of encounter or whatever it is, it would depend on the game. All of that stuff. Number two, that it be rewarding and appreciably similar to normal gameplay. That is, it looks to solve the optics problem and feels and rewards you to solve the integrated into the gameplay loop problem like the rest of the gameplay. This is a rewarding part of the normal gameplay loop. In a game where you play daily or weekly, I would want this to be like part of the normal daily or weekly cycle. It's part of the game to make an experiment with these builds. So it should be part of the game to have a mode where you can test those out and figure them out. It sucks when you're excited making builds for a game, but between getting the build options and the build is entirely complete, the game doesn't actually do anything here in the middle, and you basically just can't play for that middle part, even though you're very excited to use that new stuff you have. That is unnecessary, and so the purpose of this content is to fill that gap. Therefore, we can presume that this content is of overall medium difficulty. Not too easy, or it wouldn't be necessary to test. I certainly hope there are things in the game that are not so, that are easy enough, that you don't need to build an exactly calibrated combo build to overcome them. But also, presumably if it's valuable to test this, then there is some harder thing where you would fail unless you had it more calibrated. And number three, that it be somehow encouraging you to experiment. This might seem like a little bit of a gimme because we've been talking about experimenting for 45 minutes, but it's important. It's an important point because I think that in a lot of games, there is a mode that you could use this way, but the game doesn't encourage you to use it that way. And this is important because not everybody is me, sitting around wanting to test things. The game doesn't actually give you a reason to use it to test out lots of parts of the game. Now, games don't have to force you to play every way you could possibly play them, but again, in many of these games, the game is about trying and playing with new builds. So why wouldn't you have a game mode that was designed for that? Now, you're probably wondering for this point, what do you mean? I can easily imagine the player picks what type of, mini boss they fight, and I can kind of imagine it being of middling difficulty. But what do you mean by it's part of the game that the player experiments? As a simple example, let's use these gacha game examples you gave before. These are games where they specifically have a ton of characters. The way the game markets is by having a build system. Basically, it's weird to say it that way, that adds in new characters all the time. And these are new game pieces that you can slot into a team with a few other characters and have a grand old time. Or become bankrupt. Please don't gamble. Use your free-to-play currency to purchase the... Anyway, whatever it is, they're games like that, right? And so obviously it's of keen importance to the marketing and money people for the game that you be interested in trying all these different options. It should therefore be a no-brainer, I would think, for the game to like give you a benefit for using a variety of characters. So here's the basic type of thing I'm suggesting. Put a mode in the game where you specifically need to clear boss challenges or something with a variety of characters. That is, you get more points or a better score, more rewards when you clear the content, and you can kind of adjust which type of boss with different characters or teams or builds up to a cap. And actually, there are games that do something that flirts with this. If you've played Genshin Impact or Chaos Zero Nightmare, and I bet it's in a lot of similar games, there's this thing that Genshin Impact calls Spiral Abyss, which is a challenge dungeon that resets like every 6 weeks or something, I don't remember, that you clear with 2 complete teams. Now, 2 complete teams is a little low, slash complete team is a little bit of an issue for me, but it's the same concept, right? It's asking you to use a small variety of builds, for each character and then assembled into 2 teams to clear through the content. It's rewarding some variety. Now, the problem is that I don't think that this content checks the other 2 boxes. It's not actually very good for experimenting because it is often the hardest thing in Genshin Impact it is. In Chaos Zero Nightmare, I guess that's a whole other topic. And it doesn't ask you for very much variety. Also, furthermore, it kind of is asking you to have completely assembled teams. And also, Spiral Abyss is time limited, which a lot of the rest of the game isn't in Genshin Impact. I only give these things as specific examples to show that you probably wouldn't want your testing game mode to be like that. You want it to be something that is, if anything, a little less restricted than the rest of the game. And I think the benefit here is to get the player to use pieces they don't always use. Some benefit to get the player out of their mains, if you will. Furthermore, you can probably do double team by making sure the player could clear it with their main stuff if they wanted, if they just want the rewards, but make it beneficial in some way to not do that. I don't know. Like maybe giving more rewards for characters that have less played time, or giving more rewards once you go further than testing, 2 full teams, but again, still up to a cap. The player doesn't have to feel FOMO for not testing forever. They're allowed to just bring whatever they have. It could also be interesting for a game mode like this to do something like give you a high score rather than success or failure. So imagine that you play a team and your combo build doesn't really work, it doesn't really go off, and you die. But imagine that in the context of this game mode, you don't actually die. Your HP hits 0 and you stop scoring, but you can continue executing your build if you want to, kind of like an arcade game zeroing out. But you can still operate the game if you want. This very organically puts a testing room in front of you, but has it as a gameplay action. It's basically the same as playing the game normally, and you can do all the things you can do in a testing room. And I just think that that's a clearly much cleaner implementation. It might seem like extra steps, like, well, why are you bending over so backwards to not just make it a testing room? But this is a testing room. I mean, you literally you could just like the Simulacrum in Warframe, go up to a kiosk in a completely empty, calm room, type in whatever enemy you want to spawn, click, it spawns in, you go fight it, you maybe succeed, and it's just that unlike in a normal testing room or sandbox, you get rewards if you succeed. But if you fail, you also get to just keep fighting. And your build has a kind of immortality that you can switch on in a lot of these testing rooms so that you can see how your build would have done if you had, whatever. And that's very simple change. It would not be complicated to implement in many games. I think would be enough to basically give you the benefit of a testing room without actually derailing gameplay so that you need to figure out how the build will work. You can do it live in a way that the game just kind of covers or has anticipated somehow. You agree that when you break it down from the perspective of build systems, it's quite obvious that that is a core part of these games, don't you think? And so all I'm suggesting is that we'll then embrace it. And again, I know that the level below is that a lot of game developers don't understand that the build system is part of the fun of the game. A lot of players don't understand that. But this is meant to guide us toward that being a normal part of gameplay, not to derail it. The one fly in the ointment is that my system doesn't include a way to practice movement outside of this like training type testing game mode, but it's pretty easy to do that. Just let the player move around as they walk up to the kiosk where they set up the challenges or something like that. And a lot of games actually don't have this. Like if it's a turn-based game, there is no execution, so you don't need to be able to practice the physical component. Again, in so many games, such a majority of games where there is this component of like you operating the game or moving around, you already can do that on your way or in the environment where you do these challenges. So I feel like that's a pretty easy one to, we can mostly hand wave that. I don't think you need to design a game mode specifically for just that part. In many games where it applies, it will happen naturally, I think. Not to say it's not important. I just feel like it's probably pretty easy. I don't think we need to worry about that. What do you think? Is this kind of a solution? I think it is. I feel like the ability to make the game be about these things is also very tied to how much the general public perceives build systems as being a thing that games are about. Again, that the general public understands fun and game design enough to understand that the build system is part of the fun, even though it doesn't look like an action game or whatever when you're making the build, and sometimes it does. That is still like part of the game, and it is a little weird to me how much people still say that it isn't. Even though I don't know, I feel like there's a growing trend that the industry is going in this direction. Delightful. But I would love to see it go even further to include these game modes a little bit more coherently. And again, I have seen things vaguely like this. It's a pretty obvious idea once you break the problem down. I hope it doesn't seem like I'm saying I masterminded this extremely clever plan that no developer is smart enough to do. Now, on the contrary, I was able to give you a few examples of games that kind of do it, though it's not entirely clear that that's why they do those things. But anyway, I'm sure it's pretty obvious once people think about it. My explanation for why this is so uncommon is simply that people don't think about build systems. Not that it's hard to think of this if you do think about build systems. So I'm sure we'll see more of this or something like it, maybe an even better idea, I hope, in the future. What a good parlay. This is a great topic to bring up, and I also appreciate having the, even though I'm absolutely not going to do this parlay without saying sandboxes are totally unproblematic and there are no negatives. Like, no, there definitely are some negative parts. Just Rusty, I appreciate that you said, I think people often present labbing as having no downside and being pure upside, but no, there is a pretty significant problem that is pretty unavoidable as well. It's not straightforward to not have the optics problem with a sandbox mode, but it's also pretty straightforward to have the sandbox mode not be a sandbox mode and instead be gameplay. So I think this is actually pretty easy to get rid of and is largely a growing pain of the adolescence of game design that we're in the middle of. Something that wasn't a big issue previously is an issue now, but will very quickly not be an issue in the grand scheme of humanity's game design history. Let's hope. Cheers to that. Folks, if you want to get your own parlay like this one, you can get that using a link in the description. Liquid, thank you very much for your support. Looking forward to the next one.